On September 13 in 2018, I presented the following paper at the Anarchist Studies Network Conference at Loughborough University. The conference's theme was Decolonize. I am not a scholar of post-colonial studies, but I still wanted to contribute to the conference, so my idea was to see how colonial or expansionist statist or imperialist anarchism could become. I did not intend to propose imperialism, but rather tried to question the idea that anarchism was always as inherently or automatically non-imperialist as we might wish to think. When we look at older anarchist theories of revolution, there is a certain influence of the French Revolution and also a sense of territory that is quite unusual in today's anarchism. I did a thought experiment with puzzling results. If we follow the old territorial concepts of revolution, there is the danger of erecting a state that succumbs to the security dilemma and is forced to expand worldwide. 7 years ago, as well as today, I did not think that it would be a good idea or even feasible to force an anarchist order on the whole world or on anybody. But I think it is necessary to think through our theories of transformation and anarchization. And I think that a thought experiment is useful here. Therefore, I did not use empirical examples of anarchists that actually try to erect a social order without domination and do so in a certain territory that they are ready to defend against surrounding states, like, for example, in Chiapas or in Rojava or at the French ZADs, the zones to defend. In 2018, I did not make any recordings of my presentation, but I had slides and notes. For the video you are watching now, I pushed some texts on the slides so that you can see me and the text at the same time. I have not changed a word. I have also not changed a word of the notes that I will start reading to you shortly. Some of my formulations, including the title of the paper, can be seen as somewhat provocative and provoke. I wanted to provoke thoughts and arguments. At the conference, my thought experiment was criticized by several scholars and anarchists, and rightly so. I can imagine that you, dear viewer, will want to criticize what you are going to hear too. Go on, comment the video, share it on social networks and criticize it there. But do not stop at being against what I say. Please also consider that this is a search for answers. I want answers to the question of making anarchy real, not only in a temporary autonomous zone, but once and for all. How do we do this? How do we escape the dangers of state building? Please include tentative answers to these questions in your reaction to this video. I know my thought experiment does not taste sweet. Do you have anything better? I'd love to hear it. And now follows my presentation from 2018. From liberated territory to world revolution, making the case for an anarchist imperialism. Let us start the thought experiment with a revolution in the sense of Kropotkin, who advised to destroy state and capitalism in one strike and erect an order that we may want to call anarchy. But let us not stop here, but fantasize further and further, always as hostile to all states as possible, but also with some sense of what can be done and what cannot be done. And let us be surprised when we find, in the end, that we have erected an expansionist state that must force its citizens, anarchists and non-anarchists alike, to follow its rules, and that must also conquer the whole world. An anarchist state and an anarchist imperialism. Wow, gross! But I invite you, nonetheless, to listen to my version of the thought experiment, and I hope that you will find other ways to play it through. That is, other kinds of revolutions, but not wishful thinking or mere living in the concrete here and now without strategies or realistic goals for a revolutionary future. There are many other anarchist ideas of revolution today. Maybe you could work it out for them. Today, however, I will strictly limit the thought experiment to the classical idea that was developed at the end of the 19th century, albeit combined with some non-anarchist speculations about how states behave. At the beginning, propaganda is diligently undertaken so that the legitimacy of existing states is reduced and ideas of anarchist order spread. That is a very important task, finds Kropotkin. Then, on a beautiful sunny day, revolution will take place. The state institutions are overthrown and the capitalists expropriated in a short ecstatic insurrection. We are speaking of disarming the army and dispersing the police and intelligence agencies, about burning or deleting all official files that bureaucratize how things are done, owned, used, and understood. We are speaking of the abolition of existing laws and the ruthless violation of international treaties, and about stealing all resources and production factors and rights and privileges from the corporations. But even if the revolutionary anarchists can agree on common goals, which is not very likely, and even if the majority of inhabitants are opportunists that do not care about state or anti-state or anarchy or whatever, as long as they can live in some prosperity and do not have to change or think too much, which might even be likely, even if these preconditions for a successful territorial revolution are met, there will be people that liked the previous order or at least do not want anarchy. They are enemies within the territory, and the revolution will have to be secured by hindering them from restoring the old order or even erecting worse kinds of domination. So we are talking about building a new order, the peculiarities of which I will not focus on today, although they will have to include functional measures against counter-revolutionaries. But this does not happen everywhere in the world at the same time. Instead, it starts and expands on a certain territory. Unfortunately, we have to assume that revolutionary energy will at some point no longer suffice, so that there will be a revolutionary home country, let's say optimistically about the size of the EU. Everything else is foreign from a revolutionary point of view. At home, all kinds of interlinked groups, initiatives and federations are formed in the absence of state structures, but because communism, that is anarcho-communism, will have been introduced, the foreign countries will be interested in compensating their expropriated companies. Therefore, there will inevitably be war. Not because the anarchists wanted this, but because the states see an anarchist territory as a vacuum of power which is threatening additionally. Indeed, the anarchists of our territory will try to carry their subversive ideas into these countries and support revolutionaries there. This will be seen as a just reason for war by the foreign governments. But war endangers the legitimacy of the anarchist order because war makes the common good impossible. Therefore, on the one hand, revolutionaries must withstand military pressure. But on the other hand, they must also try to establish a ceasefire and achieve peaceful coexistence until the whole world is anarchistic. That means sending diplomats abroad. They negotiate not only war and peace, but also trade relations, prisoner exchanges, technical standards, jointly operated railway lines, etc. In order for diplomats to be taken seriously, they must, on the one hand, have the right appearance, courtly style and bargaining talent, for which they will probably need experience in pre-revolutionary politics. And on the other hand, they need the authentic mission of the revolutionary territory. Not only must the anarchist territory prevent that any impostors act as emissaries of anarchy and cause great diplomatic damage, but it is also necessary to give diplomats an imperative mandate, that is, a specific mandate in terms of content. For this to happen without a government, anarchy needs a territory-wide decision-making structure that can issue such orders. To be taken seriously, the diplomat must also be able to threaten the resumption of war. The anarchist territory must therefore remain defensive and armed. On the other hand, however, they must also be able to promise peace. This is even more problematic because now there must also be the possibility of ratifying and enforcing international treaties with foreign countries within the revolutionary territory. From the fact that we must enter into external relations and prove to be a reliable partner in this field, so that war is not perpetuated, arises a state. Unlike today's anarchist groups and organizations that one joins voluntarily, every resident of the anarchist area must put up with being treated as a citizen of the anarchist state from abroad, whether they like the decision-making structures or not. These structures can be designed as inclusive as possible, with consensus processes and councils and spokes, etc. But what the anarchist state promises abroad, it must also keep. And that means that it must demand and enforce obedience from all residents in this respect. Bakunin's and Kropotkin's theories are pretty rough with counter-revolutionaries anyway, but anyone who takes up arms against foreign countries after the peace agreement must be treated as a counter-revolutionary, however anarchistically they claim to be. It may even be necessary to set up appropriate organizations. That means an anarchist police force may be necessary to ensure no one acts counter-revolutionary by not stopping shooting at alien soldiers after the peace treaty is signed. The behavior of the CNT in the Spanish Civil War shows that anarchists may be willing to force their fellow combatants to do whatever they consider necessary to defend the revolution. As you can imagine, many anarchists will reject this thought experiment simply because it results in a state. But we must not see this too narrowly. The classics in particular, which also often expressed anti-state views, have repeatedly spoken out in favor of the state, provided that it abandons certain characteristics. For Proudhon, the state without government is good. For Bakunin, the state without centralism and militarism is good. And for Kropotkin, the state that can defeat the enemies of freedom. In such a state, there will inevitably be outsiders, malcontents and troublemakers. Some of them will not experience it as being anarchistic enough. They'll start planning the overthrow. There may be several variants. Some will radically reject anything that looks like rigidity and structure and will attack destructively. Others will completely reject the use of violence and undermine any anarchist state, which they will not consider anarchist at all because of its ability to wage war. They will do this with sabotage and subversion and other non-violent means. Perhaps they will collaborate with those who will work on constructive alternatives to my state, rural communities, work collectives, housing syndicates, and similar small-scale networked organizations, which, however, are likely to be quite easily established in my state. Still others will try to get into the post-human robot future or into the Stone Age past and have no sympathy with the anarchist state anyway. And perhaps there will also be those who, for all intents and purposes, find an anarchist state quite agreeable, only the immature and at the same time stubborn separatist variant is quite misguided in their view. They then strive for the better anarchist state. So it would be like today with the democratic state. The anarchist state would be criticized and attacked by anarchists. This is almost natural because anarchists hate the state, even the anarchist state. But regardless of what one wants or rejects, some things are inevitable. If my anarchist state is smashed by anarchists, we are back at the beginning of my thought experiment. So the state smashers have to not only attack the anarchist state from the inside, but also all surrounding states, and successfully so, because revolutions still create power vacuums that attract anti-anarchist activity of enemy states. So even if not the separatists of my thought experiment succeed, but instead of them the insurrectionists, the non-violents, the communards, the extropists or the primitivists, there will still be the external pressure to either create a state that withstands the foreign state's pressure, or to continue war until all are killed, all state troops or all anarchists, whoever has the military prowess and power to kill more massively than the other. In short, it is not my starting point with Kropotkin's theory of revolution that directs revolution into state building. It is the nature of international relations that makes stateless territories look like a free-for-all to be taken by the strongest or swiftest conqueror. Today, all stateless territories are stateless because the states agreed to leave them in this state. Sorry, pun intended. Think of the Antarctic, international waters or outer space. It is international agreements that make them stateless. And they are not nice places for anarchists to live in and build their utopias of freedom, love and luxury. So my argument is that one needs the approval of other states, maybe even of all other states, to have a territory they do not directly rule. My thought experiment does not stop here. There are more bad news. Having a state does not suffice at all, let alone wishing for a state and unsuccessfully fighting for one, as the Palestinians and the Kurds and others have seen. Even if you succeed in erecting an anarchist state that on the one hand uses the most inclusive egalitarian decision-making structures and that are on the other hand accepted as fellow state by the players of the international sphere, there are no guarantees. I do not claim that an anarchist state can save the internal order of itself against the surrounding enemies. States have been smashed to pieces very often in history, not by anarchists, but by their stronger neighbors or hegemons. What I do claim is that a state gives its internal order a slightly bigger chance of surviving compared to the lack of a state. That is only for foreign policy reasons. The same state may be detrimental for the anarchy of its internal order, but this aspect isn't even part of my thought experiment. I have to focus on international relations. The threat of being conquered by other states could be reduced further by treaties and memberships in international organizations like the NATO or the Warsaw Pact. For an anarchist state, however, it is improbable to be welcomed into organizations like these. Membership in the United Nations is more probable, but it is not worth much. What is needed is a network, or better an organization of like-minded territories that can plausibly promise each other sufficient military support. This is only possible if the anarchist revolution does not start or does not remain in one territory alone. It is probable that my state will engage in subversive actions and support anarchist groups in yet non-anarchist states. But even if it was not to threaten the enemy states through what they will call terrorism, these would nonetheless feel threatened by an anarchist territory. This is because even a short-lived anarchy or anarchist community in a relatively small territory has tremendous mythical power. Just think of what Spain or the Ukraine have inspired in other anarchists. So homegrown anarchists in our enemy states will point to us as a kind of proof that anarchy is possible and that therefore their own government and state are superfluous. Consequently, just by existing and being an example, an anarchist territory is a deadly threat to all states. So our anarchist state might as well send spies, revolutionaries and terrorists in these other countries and make the local anarchists into our fifth column. If this strategy succeeds, more anarchist states will blossom. This will at the same time alarm the remaining non-anarchist states to the highest degree. Domino theories and infection metaphors will rule their war propaganda, and international struggle will become even more fierce and desperate. In the end, I'm afraid, a peaceful coexistence of anarchist territories and non-anarchist states is impossible. Unless the anarchist territory so fully acts like a state that it deletes any remains of the anarchy the original revolutionaries have fought for. Maybe the anarchist state can survive between other states if it ceases to be anarchist, but let us assume that my mind-child does not develop in this direction. Let us assume that, although being an organization that is able to coerce its members into at least abiding by international treaties, this state is still able to remain partly anarchist. Then it must overthrow all states on the earth, or at least all states capable of wielding serious military power. Now just imagine how this would look on a world map. It would look like Europeans conquering the world again. My anarchist state would find itself in the role of an imperialist aggressor in the name of peace and even anti-imperialism. Of course, this counterintuitive or ironic picture would look different if this anarchist revolution started not in Europe but in the former colonies, not in the center but in the periphery. This could be possible too, but to win such wars, weaponry is needed. Handguns are everywhere, but if the expansionist anarchist state wants to threaten the enemies with nuclear weapons, it has to start in one of those states that have already enough of them because their development is so laggard. If not Europe, then the US or China. Okay, let's look to alternatives at the end, even if just to feel better. Maybe the idea of liberating a territory and then defending and expanding this free space against the surrounding systems of domination is not a good idea in the first place. There are other ideas. Think, for example, of Cory Doctorow's science fiction novel Walk Away, published last year, that is 2017, this talk is from 2018. It describes an anarcho-communist revolution that does yield every territory that is attacked by capitalists or the state just to build a new world a few kilometers away. Of course, this is only possible with 3D printing technology that is not yet available and maybe never will. But it may still be worthwhile to think about these jujutsu techniques of fighting by eluding the fight, as an alternative to my hard-boiled karate thought experiment. But even in this scenario, some of the walkaway revolutionaries choose to not give up their territory. After all, giving up a liberated territory might mean giving up freedom at all if there is no space left to turn to. And I am not sure what freedom means if every habitable place on Earth is dominated by states. Could or should anarchists give up on liberating territories? Then maybe they give up being revolutionaries too. Or should they invent new states that do look and feel like states to other states while securing as much anarchy for their inhabitants as possible given the international circumstances? I honestly do not know. My train of thoughts seems to lead me to aporia, so maybe you can help me see the flaws of my premises, my logic, or my conclusions. That's it. This is what I presented at the ASN conference in 2018. Please consider to think it through, even if it does not feel comfortable. And please invent better revolutionary strategies without states or imperialism. The comments are open.